Okay. Hi, and welcome to Pictures at a Revolution, films from and about the 60s. I'm Art Eckstein, professor of history and distinguished university professor emeritus at the University of Maryland. I'll be running the course. I've previously done 5 film courses for Ollie at Berkeley. A bit about my background. I grew up in Hollywood. The parents of my best friends were writers for Leave It to Beaver, so I've always been interested in film. I was in Berkeley in the late 60s and 70s and saw a lot of things, which also explains why I'm doing this course. I got a PhD in history, and I've published 6 books and 65 articles. I work mostly on ancient imperial expansion, but tenure is a wonderful thing. It allows you the freedom to do research in whatever you want. So I've also published on imperialism theory in general, on the prevalence of anarchy in international relations, on George Orwell, and on American history too, including a book on Hollywood film. My latest book was on the 60s radical group, the Weather Underground, based on 30,000 pages of recently declassified FBI files, which showed how incompetent they were, plus personal interviews with Weather Underground veterans, which showed they were not political cardboard cutouts, but real people. Okay, so in the course sections, I'll be lecturing for about 50 minutes or so. Then we'll take a 5-minute break, then come back for questions and discussion. People can write questions on the chat, which I'll look at during the break. And also during discussion, there's a little icon to raise your hand if you want to do it that way too. So this course is about a film revolution. First, the subject matter of Hollywood films changed. The 60s saw the rise of films about youth rebellion. Second, the style of movie making changed to a looser way of filming and a looser way of creating a narrative. This was aided by technical developments such as the lightweight handheld camera. The result was that Hollywood played a crucial role in spreading the images and the ideas of the late 60s counterculture. We'll be discussing some films that did this. But with the studios, it was always a matter of money, a matter of profit. So when countercultural films began making many times their small initial investment, the studios went in that direction. But since you follow the money, by the late 70s, Hollywood was returning to mainstream middle-brow blockbusters. The turning point here were Jaws in 1975 and Star Wars in 1977. They made profits previously beyond Hollywood imagination. Jaws was made for $9 million and took in an astounding $478 million at the box office. Star Wars, made for $11 million, just $2 million more than Jaws, took in $775 million at the box office. So we are actually dealing with a brief cultural period when small films were being made in Hollywood, a crucial period, but brief. By way of general introduction to the course, I also want to say what a movie is. We don't usually think about it, but a movie is a series of hundreds of thousands of still photographs. Each is a single still image. What gives the illusion of movement, at least in the pre-digital age, is that the separate photographs were run through a projector at 24 photographs per second, 24 images a second, 24 frames a second. At that speed, the human eye retains the after image of a photograph until the next photograph replaces it. In that way, the hundreds of thousands of still photographs simulate motion. They simulate life. Yet each frame is a separate image. Because of this, it sometimes happens that a single image or a short series of images proves to be memorable to the audience. That's true both of traditional celluloid and the recently developed digital photography, but many cinematographers prefer celluloid because it gives a richness of image that's missing with pixels. A Hard Day's Night, our movie, was shot on celluloid film and in simple black and white, and the results are, well, just beautiful. The purpose of this succession of images is to evoke emotion in the audience. That's the entertainment part. That's the purpose of every film. We do expect soaring or sad music from various banks and sharp dialogue add to a director's toolbox to elicit emotion. The combination, when you're sitting in a dark theater with stereophonic surround sound and a cinemascope screen, as in Hard Day's Night when it was first released, that is in theaters, can be overwhelming. We miss that group experience, that experience in the darkness nowadays when you can get everything at home. And there's something else about the movie experience in general. Movies offer you the chance to be there, close to the danger and the thrill, and yet safe. They give us the wondrous opportunity to be there in the field of danger, yet undamaged by it, to be moved by the romantic story, yet not severely wounded by it, to live and not die, to hear the fusillade at the OK Corral, but not have to worry that a ricochet might pick you off, to ride with Custer's regiment as it foolishly charges into the trap on the Little Bighorn, but simultaneously to be safe in your chair and not have to smell the horses. For a course on the 60s, it means to be there in the baggage car on the train as the Beatles play just for you in close-up, to be there right in front of Marty Balin of the Jefferson Airplane as he swoons, I think kind of doped up, at the start of the beautiful song Today, to be there with Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda on their choppers in Monument Valley, to be there with a young Bob Dylan as he first arrives lone in wintry New York City, to be there, yet simultaneously to be safe. It's an extraordinary experience, really, and actually an extraordinary privilege to be able to do that. So, as prelude to the real 60s revolutionary period, we're starting off today with the famous Beatle film, A Hard Day's Night from 1964. You've all got access to a terms and concept sheet to help you follow along in my lecture today. That went out to people who had registered for the class last week. I'm going to proceed by first discussing the early Beatles, then the plot of the film, then the story of its production, and then its impact. This will take about 50 to 55 minutes, and by that time you'll be tired of my voice. And so after a 5-minute break, we'll then have 30 minutes or so for questions, comments, and conversation. I'll sum up A Hard Day's Night in one sentence. It's the smoothest, freshest, funniest, most revolutionary film ever made for purposes of commercial exploitation. Of course, it's pretty bold of me, a sedentary university presser who can barely play a guitar, to give a lecture. Of course, I can play guitar, being a 60s person, to give a lecture on the Beatles, as I'm about to do. I admit it. I'm not a musician. In justification, I'll quote from the great American musician Aaron Copland. Quote, "If you want to know about the 60s, play the music of the Beatles." So, when John Lennon in Liverpool was only 16 years old, and Paul McCartney and George Harrison were only 15 years old, they started a rock band. In 1960, they dropped out of school to play rock and roll as professionals. They named the band the Beatles. The name is not accidental. It's been forgotten now, but it was in homage to the American rock and roll band, Buddy Holly and the Crickets. So from Crickets to Beatles. The Beatles' early music was influenced by Buddy Holly's high-energy hits, especially That'll Be the Day. But Buddy Holly had died in a plane crash in 1959. And as for the young Beatles, in 1960, George Harrison was deported from Germany because under German law, he was still too young to play for money. I mean, they started very, very young. The band shuttled between grungy nightclubs in Hamburg, Germany, and grungy nightclubs in working-class Liverpool, where they perfected their song. In Hamburg, they sometimes fronted for the great Black American blues singer Little Richard, who taught them the basics of the blues. Also in Hamburg in 1961, Astrid Kirchherr, a Bohemian woman friend, first cut their hair long and in their signature mop-top look. This was a style of hair generally popular in the Hamburg hipster scene in 1961, and it went by the nickname the Exie, short for, wait for it, existentialist. Now, in the early 60s, the popular music was still dominated by 50s style solo singers, male idols backed by anonymous studio bands. It was the old Frank Sinatra and then Elvis Presley model. We're talking Bobby Van and Frankie Avalon. Part of the Beatles' revolution was this: not one solo singer, but three powerful singer-songwriters, a much louder, high-energy sound, three-part harmony backed by harmonica, drumming, and powerful electric guitars. The Beatles had two great songwriters in John Lennon and Paul McCartney, and their enormous flood of songs was performed by a rock band of three guitarist singers and a ferocious drummer. We now think of this as the classic rock band structure, the classic rock band setup. But in early 60s Britain, it was not. That type of music wasn't on the radio yet. So when people heard the Beatles, they heard musical change. The Beatles were founders of this change. But it wasn't just the music. As Paul McCartney says, we were in the vanguard of something more momentous than just music. It was a revolution in the culture, especially among the young. Capture the culture. By spring 1964, this music was all anyone young in Britain or America wanted to hear. And in America, this new model rock and roll band, again, we think of that as the rock and roll band, but in 1964, it was the new model rock and roll band produced immortal bands, the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, the Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead. All of them had multiple singers, multiple songwriters, backed by powerful electric guitars and backed by the brand new, far louder Fender amplifiers, a real change. In spring 1965, the famous folk singer Bob Dylan turned electric too, and the powerful guitar backup group Dylan helped form in summer 65 became the band. Now, this music revolution depended on commercial success. Vast numbers of young people buying vinyl records, singles, and albums in record stores. Remember them? In the spring and summer of '63, the Beatles were suddenly a total smash hit phenomenon in Britain, with songs #1 in sales for weeks and weeks. #1, From Me to You, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And even when these songs were no longer absolutely #1 in sales, they remained on the top 10 sales charts for weeks. The Beatles' first album, Meet the Beatles, ! Remained on the top British sales charts for months. In America in 1964, Meet the Beatles was the #1 album in the country for 11 straight weeks. It was replaced only by the Beatles' second album. So the Beatles, I'm sorry to say it in some ways, were first of all a tremendously successful capitalist commercial phenomenon, a tremendously successful commercial project. In April 1964, they held all top 5 songs in the US Billboard 100 of sales, including Please Please Me, I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, and Can't Buy Me Love. This had never happened to one group before, that all 5 best-selling songs would be from one group, and it never would happen again. The Beatles, of course, also revolutionized fashion in clothes and male hairstyles, and people copied them. In an ever wealthier society, they therefore accelerated the increasing opportunities for personal, individual expression. In our course, we're going to be looking at movies that overtly articulated ideas that a community might at first only dimly feel. A Hard Day's Night is a case in point. It offered terrific music, yes, but above all, A Hard Day's Night offered an attitude. Now, it's sometimes charged that at this stage, the Beatles were merely playing catchy but simple bubblegum music. I mean, I want to hold your hand, ooh, I want to hold your hand. It's not Shakespeare. But even the Beatles' early hits had musical complexity. The band is tight, fast, and hard rocking. Uh, the Beatles learned this style of playing in the rough bars in Hamburg, where the audiences were definitely not bubblegummy teenagers. Still, it's only in early 1965, with John Lennon's You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, that the band moves towards a mature and more introspective style. But by then, the Beatles were so popular that they could lead their audience into more difficult music, which is what they did. By then, too, Bob Dylan had introduced them to marijuana, or so the legend goes. In any case, the revolution in 63 and 64 was that young people in Britain, and then in the US too, a vast market, were buying Beatles records in giant numbers, unprecedented numbers. It was the post war baby boom generation's first flexing of its enormous commercial power. Uh, I'm going to start talking a little bit about the movie itself because what the Beatles did with their commercial success, giant commercial success, was make a movie. The project was set in motion in autumn 63. But A Hard Day's Night was the first Beatles film because they said no to not one, not two, but five other earlier projects that came flooding in the summer and spring and summer of 63 because of their commercial success. The first project was called The Yellow Teddy Bears, and the investor insisted on writing all the songs himself. Well, no. But during the summer of 63, the Beatles rejected four other offers for what they called cheap rip-off pop musicals. The Beatles knew all about what they called grotty rock films. They'd been seeing them since they were teenagers. Cheap quickies like Espresso Bongo, 1960, starring the British singer Cliff Richard. They didn't want to do anything like that. Amid their huge creativity, they wanted a film that was really artistic. And that was the choice that they made. They could have made a cheap rip-off exploitation movie, and they turned that down. A key figure in these decisions was their business manager, Brian Epstein. Epstein was a young Liverpool gay businessman who became besotted with the Beatles' music early on, and he was part of the younger generation too. So the band's contract with him in 1961 to be their manager allowed them huge artistic freedom. That's usually not the case. He agreed when they wanted to replace their original drummer, Pete Best, with Ringo Starr. The matching mod suits we see in A Hard Day's Night were Epstein's idea. So was the coordinated bowing, which we see in the film, which drove teenage girls wild. He helped create Northern Songs, the Beatles' music publishing company, and he was the best man at John Lennon's wedding in 1962. Epstein himself never signed the managerial contract in order that the Beatles could fire him at any time. They never did. He was an expert at merchandising the band. He's part of the genius behind their popularity, but only part because, of course, he had a terrific product. Both McCartney and Lennon later said that they signed any performance contract Epstein presented to them without reading it because they had total faith in him. but Epstein died of a drug overdose in 1967. He was only 32. Some Beatleologists suggest that the Beatles might not have broken up if he lived. So A Hard Day's Night is utterly different from the four cheap jukebox musical they were offered in summer '63. The Beatles were no synthetic act to be exploited by low-life film producers. They were above all, and this was revolutionary, authentic. What made the Lennon-McCartney songs different was that they somehow transmitted feelings too powerful for normal speech, presented with astounding extroverted energy and skill. This is why these songs still speak to us. Among other things, these songs were the result of sheer professionalism. Every song on those early Beatles records is the result of 20 or 30 rehearsal takes. They were perfectionist. And if you ever, there are documentaries showing them making later albums, and you can see what perfectionists they are. Okay, so that's a kind of general introduction to them. It's the attitude, it's not just the music, it's the attitude that was revolutionary. Okay, I'm now going to talk about the plot of the film. I always like to give a synopsis of the main narrative in the film so that we're all on the same page when we're later discussing it. This synopsis, though, comes with some extra comments by me. A Hard Day's Night starts with a crash chord. 60s are here. It's dissonant and played loud by George Harrison on his 12-string electric guitar, F over G, with McCartney on bass. The Beatles are running fast through a provincial city to escape a horde of screaming fangirls, and they board a train for a TV station in London. Actually, this was filmed in London, and actually the screaming girls were all paid extras. It's artificial. A Hard Day's Night looks like a documentary, and that was intentional, but it's not a documentary. It's all scripted. It's fiction. That is, nobody simply plays themselves in A Hard Day's Night, not even the Beatles. All characters are fictional. The four main characters bear the Beatles' names, and they're played by the band members, but they are only exaggerated versions of the real people. And they follow a script. Now, luckily for everybody, each of the four Beatles turned out to be a gifted actor. En route to London, the band meets Paul McCartney's troublemaking Irish grandfather. Paul calls his grandfather a king mixer, someone who loves to sow discord. And the grandfather will do this to the Beatles and to everybody else throughout the film. The grandfather was played by Wilfrid Bramble, who at the time was as famous in Britain as the Beatles themselves. Wilfrid Bramble's forgotten now, but at the time, he was a major entertainment presence. His popularity came through his role as a dirty old man in the hit British comedy show Steptoe and Son. That show was later reworked in the US as Sanford and Son, with great black actor and comic Red Fox in the Bramble role. But Bramble, who seems to be somebody we're not paying too much attention to in the film, was as large an entertainment presence in 1964 in Britain as the Beatles themselves. An uptight British businessman enters the Beatles' compartment and objects to the loud music on their transistor radio. I'll be talking about the transistor radio revolution next week. The Beatles argue that they have as much right as he does to be in the railway carriage since they bought first-class tickets just like him. There it is again, the baby boomer financial power. It's a theme of today's lecture. The businessman snarls, "Don't take that tone with me. I fought the war for your sort." Ringo responds, "I bet you're sorry you won." A classic statement of youth rebellion of the 60s. And actually, this incident was based on a real railway incident that happened to the Beatles before the Beatles became famous. John Lennon was the person who insisted that this incident be made in the film. The director, Richard Lester, feared that the Beatles would be stressed by having to perform in small spaces before a crowded film production unit. There was special difficulty with the intrusive, old-fashioned, huge boom microphones towering over them in every scene. You don't really see this. You just think they're speaking normally, but there are these enormous boom microphones towering over them during the filming. Uh, but the Beatles had no problem with this because they were consummate natural actors and comics. The band then goes off to play cards in a baggage car and entertain some schoolgirls with a song. I Should Have Known Better is the song. One of the seemingly ordinary fangirls spotlighted in the baggage car scene is Patty Boyd, a stunning presence who was already a professional model. She was explicitly cast for this part by Richard Lester. She's not a found extra. She would go on to marry George Harrison, and after that, to marry Eric Clapton. And she later wrote a very good book about her adventures with the great musicians. But already in 1964, Patty Boyd was not a naive young teenager. That depiction, like so much in the film, was an illusion. Still, she symbolized the love for the Beatles that many ordinary teenagers felt. And actually, there were often real mobs of Beatles fans, real Beatle fans, not paid extras, lurking around during the outdoor shooting. In London, the Beatles feel confined in their hotel room because their chubby manager, Norm, he's an affectionate version of Brian Epstein, orders them to personally answer every piece of fan mail that they're getting, and there's a huge amount of fan mail. They sneak out to a party only to be caught by Norm. Then they find out that Paul's grandfather, masquerading as Lord McCartney, has gone to a gambling club. They recapture him and pack him back to the hotel. The next day, the Beatles arrive at the TV studio. After initial rehearsal, the TV producer hates them because Paul's grandfather has told him falsely that the Beatles think he's a moron. The fuzzy producer in his colorful sweater seems now like an anti-gay portrayal. It would never be allowed today, but in 1964, it's just another joke. This was part of the cultural revolution of the 60s that we 60s people brought about, that now it could never be done. Then, at a press conference, reporters asked the Beatles stupid questions. Are you a mod or a rocker? A reporter asked Ringo. No, I'm a mocker, Ringo says. Another example of youth rebellion. Bob Dylan famously adopted the same snarky attitude during his press conferences, and that became a model of snarkiness for many teenagers. The Beatles escape the press conference and cavort happily in a field to the song Can't Buy Me Love. That looks like just such a natural expression of energy, but it's all been carefully synchronized by Richard Lester, the director. He synchronized their antics and the music, and it's done over and over till they get it right. It's in fact the opposite of carefree, however it looks. George Harrison is then lured into a trendmonger's office to audition for a clothing advertisement. His snotty remarks about the artificiality of arranged trend-setting clothes, again underlining the commercial power of the young that's now coming into being. His snotty remarks get him thrown out, but it's a portrayal of the soulless commercialism already threatening the younger generation and would eventually threaten Haight-Ashbury too. And the heaviest acting weight in the film is actually borne by Ringo, who was only 23 at the time. An hour before the TV show, Ringo is forced to chaperone Paul's comically evil grandfather. The grandfather convinces Ringo to go out to experience life instead of always reading books. Ringo tries to get a quiet drink in a pub, takes pictures with his camera, walks along the river, commiserates with a lonely child. After accidentally causing a woman to fall into a newly dug hole, this was actually the last scene in the film that was filmed. Ringo is arrested as a troublemaker and is then joined by Paul's grandfather, who's been attempting to sell Beatles photos with forged signatures. The grandfather declares himself to be a member of the Irish Republican Army, a martyr to the cause, and sings a famous IRA song, A Nation Once Again. That song was famous in Britain, but I think it was lost in the US. That's what the significance was. Then the police just let him go. He runs to the studio and tells the others where Ringo is. John, Paul, and George rush to retrieve Ringo. The boys arrive back at the studio with Ringo with only minutes to spare before airtime. The televised concert is actually a smash hit. The Beatles are then whisked away by helicopter to another performance in another city, joined by Paul's grandfather, with Paul tossing the old man's forged photographs out of the helicopter as it takes off. That's the last scene, the forged photographs falling down. So the theme in the last scene of the movie is youth authenticity, Paul tossing the forged photographs away. And also, I have to say, hostility, even if gentle, towards the elderly. I never noticed that hostility until my wife, Judy Gumbo Albert, who's also a published author, pointed it out yesterday. Because even at 79, which is my age, I identified with the Beatles, not with Paul's grandfather. And yet Wilfred Bramble, the grandfather, was only 52 when the film was made. How I'd love to be 52 again. So now I want to talk about the production, because no film, no movie just appears out of thin air. As Tom Hanks has stressed, all movies are the result of difficult work done by flawed human beings, working under very stressful schedule pressures and, above all, money pressures. That was true of A Hard Day's Night, too. What happened was, in August '63, the major American film studio, United Artists, made an offer of $500,000 to finance a Beatles. The UA executives did this in part because there were two top United Artists executives that made the offer, because their teenage daughters were urging them to do this, and they could suddenly see financial prospects as a result. The UA executives planned to recoup their investment of $500,000, not from the box office, because they didn't think the Beatles were going to last very long, but rather from the soundtrack album, which would be released in tandem with the film. Now, the Beatles already had a recording contract from 1962 with Capitol Records, but Capitol Records neglected to secure rights to profit from a Beatles soundtrack album, because in 1962, no one thought that the Beatles would stay popular long enough to do a movie. Well, things changed fast in the 60s. So United Artists, the movie company, and not Capitol Records, the music company, would get the soundtrack profits, and they were big, and that's what UA was counting on. They weren't counting on the movie being a big hit. They had no idea what the movie was going to be like. They were counting on the soundtrack. And the UA executives themselves feared that the Beatles were merely a phenomenon that would soon run out of steam. So they set a deadline of July 1964 for release of the film. That was part of the contract. It had to be made from scratch in 9 months. The Beatles accepted the deal because UA proposed Richard Lester as the director. Lester was an American, but he'd lived in the UK for 10 years and had directed many episodes of the anarchic British TV comedy show, The Gong Show, which I'm sure few people have heard of here, but it was a huge hit in Britain and was another kind of precursor of the youth revolution. Uh, that show was a favorite of the Beatles, especially John Lennon. Lester already liked the Beatles' music himself and leaped at the chance to direct them in a movie, not knowing exactly what the movie would be yet. He'd also previously worked with the proposed screenwriter, the anti-capitalist left-wing Liverpool writer Alan Owen, who was another favorite of John Lennon. So Lennon is really behind a lot of what's going on. A Hard Day's Night, Lester decided, would be shot using what's called cine verite style in black and white, semi-documentary. And as I said, while it looks like a documentary, it's fiction. The documentary style was because Richard Lester was deeply affected by the relaxed, handheld camera French New Wave films, the movement led by Jean-Luc Godard and Francois Truffaut. In some sense, A Hard Day's Night is another French New Wave film. And A Hard Day's Night, with its black and white semi-documentary feel, in fact looks a lot like Jean-Luc Godard's famous breakthrough film, Breathless, also focused on young people, from 1960. A major theme of the film is the Beatles' entrapment in their own fame. So Richard Lester intentionally films the Beatles in small, cramped rooms, in places with low ceilings, in narrow corridors. At one point, Paul's grandfather says, I thought I was gonna get a change of scenery, but so far I've been in a train in a room, and a car in a room, and now a room in a room. The line was originally spoken by John Lennon, but Paul's grandfather gets the point across. All of this was all intentionally done, these Beatles being in cramped spaces. All of this explains our relief when the Beatles escape from the moronic news conference into that open field. The sense of elation we in the audience feel when the Beatles finally break out is actually the result of emotional manipulation by a talented director. It's not, he did it to make us feel that way. As we said, United Artists imposed a strict July 1964 deadline for release of the film. That was to take advantage of what executives believed would be a teenage fancy for the Beatles that was only temporary. In late '63, Richard Lester met with the Beatles to block out 6 weeks, that's all that time they would have to make the film, in the Beatles' schedule when they would be free to make a movie. Because the Beatles manager, Brian Eckstein, had set up a Beatles tour of the US for February '64, actual filming had to be delayed into March and April. That was really pushing it in terms of a post-production and editing and time to get a finished public release in July. I mean, it is really striking. They film at the filming ends at the end of April, and they're ready to put it out at the early July. While the Beatles were in America, Richard Lester and Alan Owen came up with the film, with the idea of structuring the film as an exaggerated day in the life of the Beatles, with the theme of the Beatles as prisoners of their own fame. What happened, though, was that the Beatles' February tour of the US turned out to be a total triumph. When they appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, the TV audience was 73 million, the largest audience in television history up to that time. And all those screaming girls, what did that mean? Feminist writers later rightly called it a mass jailbreak from 1950s style repression. It's very, 50s girls, 50s teenage girls didn't do a lot of this, but this was, again, an example of we're breaking free. The band came back to Britain exhausted, and they hadn't yet made the movie. Yet immediately after return, they sat down and in 2 days recorded in finished version all 11 songs for the movie. By the way, this means that all the singing you see in the film, it's lip synced. No matter how it looks, it wasn't live singing, even during the live TV show finale. It's artificial. A Hard Day's Night began principal photography on March 2nd, 64, just 3 days after the Beatles had recorded all 11 songs in 2 days. Richard Lester worked efficiently and finished filming in 6 weeks, ending on schedule on April 24th. Then they had to do what's called post-production to edit down the huge amount of raw footage into a watchable film. I'm going to talk about that kind of post-production when we talk about Easy Rider, where Dennis Hopper took 6 months to edit down everything he'd made for Easy Rider. They had 10 weeks, actually 6 weeks, to get that into shape. They have to edit it down. They had to dub the sound. They had to make sure the sound mix was good and eventually print the ready for theater prints. It all did get done. Now, our film was made under the working title Beatlemania. I'm sure people don't know this, but at the very end of filming, Lester came up with the new title, A Hard Day's Night. It was based on something Ringo had said at dinner just when they were finishing filming. Everyone loved it. It captured in one phrase, A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles' hyperactive lifestyle, the incessant demands and pressures on them, and the film's worker left-wing perspective. But having done that, having decided on A Hard Day's Night, they then needed a title song. Well, Lennon and McCartney sat down and wrote it in one night, and A Hard Day's Night was ready for recording the next morning, and it was another hit. The creative energy is just amazing. Lester was overjoyed to use the song's Crashing from Nowhere introductory chord as the Crashing from Nowhere start of the film. Crash, the 60s have arrived. Actually, the same thing happened with a second Beatles film, Help. The title for the film only emerged at dinner with Richard Lester at the very last minute. And what happened? Lennon and McCartney had the title song ready for recording the very next morning. And it was soon a hit. The talent is just stunning. A rough cut of A Hard Day's Night was ready by mid-May, again astonishing considering that filming only ended in April. And United Artists executives were happy with the result. Well, of course, they were ready to be pleased because by May 1964, when they saw the rough cut, the Beatles were no longer just a popular British band. They had become an international sensation. Thanks to their tour of the US in February, the Beatles now totally dominated the record-buying charts in America as well as Britain. And the American market was vast in scale. Huge money was now involved. And so they were happy that this was suddenly going to be a film made with huge international stars. Walter Shenson, the United Artists producer in charge of A Hard Day's Night, now increased the Beatles' share of potential net box office profits from the contracted mere 7% to 20% of net return. An extraordinarily generous gesture. I should say net return is film exhibitors take 50% of all profits. That's the gross. The net is what is left over to the actual filmmakers. But Shenson was offering 20% of net return. That was an extraordinary gesture. But Shenson wanted to avoid accusations of shortchanging the enormously popular Beatles, and he also wanted to produce the next Beatles film, that is, Help. United Artists arranged for the premiere of A Hard Day's Night to be at the London Pavilion, This was United Artists Showcase Cinema Theatre in London. Having seen the premiere and with the Beatles a sudden sensation on an international scale, they now promoted the film with all stops out. I don't think they intended to when the film was being suggested and made, but suddenly there it was. So in the 60s, how and where you are allowed to open a film in a theater is important for box office success. I'll give you an example. In 1967, old Jack Warner of Warner Brothers hated Bonnie and Clyde, and he tried to kill it with grungy venues. He failed because the rebellious youth audience loved Bonnie and Clyde anyway, but he intentionally put it in grungy venues in order to kill it. United Artists did the opposite, giving A Hard Day's Night red carpet treatment. On July 6, 1964, Princess Margaret and her husband, Lord Snowdon, headed the list of swanky invitees to the most important cinema theater in London. Within weeks, A Hard Day's Night was showing in 120 movie theaters in the UK alone. It opened in the US in August 64, and in the US alone, the movie made back its total cost, the original investment, in the first week at the box office. So now to the impact of the film. First, financials. I'm sure you're going to get sick of my giving you numbers, but money talks in Hollywood. On an investment of $500,000, A Hard Day's Night eventually made $11 million. That is 22 times the original investment. Above all, it was young people who flocked to see the film. This was a warning of what was to come in terms of the economic power of the boomer generation audience and what they wanted to see. By the way, A Hard Day's Night was second in box office in the US. The first money winner was Dr. Strangelove, or How I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love the Bomb. Dr. Strangelove was Stanley Kubrick's bitter satire on the US Strategic Air Command and its preparations for fighting a nuclear war. Young people were a main audience for this anti-establishment film, too. It's another indication that the 60s had arrived, that they would dare to make a movie about satire on the Strategic Air Command. A Hard Day's Night projected the four Beatles' irresistible charisma to the world, including their resistance to hierarchy, as in that scene with the businessman, and to traditional ways of doing things. Their energetic and, above all, self-confident articulation of possibilities. They'd had the trust in themselves, even at only age 22 and 23, to turn away projects that they knew weren't good enough for their talent, and the talent to find and choose the project that was good enough for their talent. John, Paul, George, and Ringo's faith in their own judgment, which was also encouraged by Brian Epstein, as shown in their actions and in the film itself, all of this had a huge impact on so many who experienced it in the film. It inspired new vocations, new dreams. It made the Beatles not just the world's greatest rock and roll band, not just the world's most popular rock and roll band, but moral exemplars and leaders for millions. And where they led us eventually was onto the streets of Haight-Ashbury, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Now, 61 years later, hard to believe, 61 years later, everything in A Hard Day's Night sustains. The film looks as fresh as ever. It looks as if it was made yesterday. Okay, folks, so let's take a 5 or 6 minute break. If you have questions, you can put them on chat, or you can wait and we can have them for discussion. And I'm going to see if anybody's put on stuff on chat now. Okay, I see people have. Okay. Huh. I'm, I don't know. Are we on? I don't know.
Well, I'm still filming, so to say. I'm recording. I can see everybody. Uh,
Okay, well, let's ask
I,
people,
I,
folks, have you been able to hear this? Oh, they have. Okay. So, but just to recite, Kate said that she was in Rhodesia uh, in, I guess this would have been late 63, early 64, and the Beatles were already hugely popular in Rhodesia before they broke into the American market. And that suggests that empire isn't just physical, but cultural. And that Rhodesia, for all of its terrible problems and semi attempts at independence, was part of the British cultural sphere in a way that the US wasn't. Uh, and actually, one of the things I want to say about this, which is a really fascinating thing, is that uh, the cross-Atlantic cultural conversation, which the Beatles really initiated, continued in a different way, was that the Beatles, because of their connections to black music and the Rolling Stones too, and the Blues Breakers, all these British blues bands were picking up old records by black blues people in Britain and recording. And it was those white bands' versions of black blues
yeah.
that then crossed the Atlantic again and was introducing people to the black bluesmen and women from the Delta and Chicago. And I first got involved in blues listening to especially the Blues Breakers, which had early Eric Clapton as the lead guitarist. Uh, and so it was a cross-Atlantic conversation, cultural conversation that was going on. So I think that's a very interesting, and the Beatles initiated it. The British invasion, oh, another example we'll be talking about from the summer after their February blast is the Animal song House of the Rising Sun, which was a huge hit in the United States, a revelation because it was so long in terms of radio play, and that song was the Animals version of Bob Dylan's version of the black version. And so there is this incredible kind of mix that was going on. It's why B.B. King becomes an idol. That's really he only becomes rich in the late '60s because white folks are listening to him, but they're listening to him because they're being told by the British this is great music, and so it's a fascinating kind of thing. Um, okay, so I think. Jim, you want to repeat your question about depression and exhilaration after Kennedy's assassination?
Well, I've never really known how to look at it, but after Kennedy's assassination, I think it's safe to say America was in a huge depression,
Mm.
saddened, and spirits were low. And
Shock.
yeah,
Oh.
yeah, and then this phenomenal appearance of the Beatles uh, either helped us get out of it or was so overwhelmingly popular because it's just what we needed when we needed it, perhaps. So I've just wondered if those two events are in some way connected.
Um, I think that certainly people were looking for relief, and that was certainly part of it. But hmm, my own attitude. I mean, well, I was interested in the Kennedy assassination and did some work for Mark Lane, the Rush to Judgment. I was a junior, no, I was a freshman in college at the time. So I was obsessed with the Kennedy assassination that way. But um, it was also an attitude of anti-establishment. I mean, so part of what's going on also is not just the Kennedy assassination, but the Warren Commission report,
Mm,
um, which people distrusted.
yeah.
Actually, I, yes and no about the Warren Commission report. We now know that Lyndon Johnson told the Warren Commission to make Lee Harvey Oswald the killer alone because if they said he was a Russian or Cuban agent, Lyndon Johnson would be forced to go to war. We have that on tape. He's talking to one of his mentors on the commission. So there was all this distrust, and certainly the Beatles are showing tremendous distrust to anyone over 30. Right? So
Yeah.
that's certainly going on. I think that was going on. And people are saying, how about my attitude? How did it change with the launch of the Beatles? Uh, I sure saw the film when it came out that summer, and that was the summer that I began college. Um, I think the anti-establishment thing certainly affected me, although I think I was more affected by the free speech movement at Cal. Um, and by 65, uh, I wanted to get blue jeans. I wanted to look like a civil rights worker, but I didn't know how to get blue jeans from Levi's. I had to buy a pair of used blue jeans from somebody so I could have blue, which I, in fact, am wearing now. And so, but the Beatles in general, kind of distrustful and anti-establishment and thinking for themselves attitude certainly affected me. But I think it was sometimes politics is local. So Cal affected me, uh, People's Park affected me, things like that. My wife and I were in the same demonstrations. We just didn't know each other in the 60s at the time. But the Beatles certainly did, and especially where they went, because where they went was towards sophisticated music. I mean, I sure like the early stuff. Everybody calls it bubblegum. I think it's terrific. It's positive, it's encouraging. But where they went was important in the same way that Dylan was important. I think I was more affected by Dylan's kind of beat poetry stuff in 64 and 65. But that's where they were going. That's where the Beatles themselves were going. The enormous power they had to lead people is striking. And I mean, it's also, they were aware of this. So I have in the living room, Paul McCartney's photographs of the tour in 64. He was taking photographs at the moment they were actually doing things. So that's the cinema culture also to do. Um, So somebody's saying, Ramby is saying, you speak as if the film would be accepted today as well in the 60s. To me, the music was okay, but the grandfather's type of humor was sophomoric. And although the film critics raved about the film, wouldn't they reject the film today? Uh, I think the grandfather is sophomoric humor and very hostile to old people, which it makes me more sensitive than I would have been in '64 to that. The anti-gay thing is actually pretty shocking if you watch it, and that certainly would have caused tremendous negative comments in the film critics. Um, there are no black people in the film. There are no Asians in the film. It's a Britain that no longer exists,
Mm.
and actually didn't exist at the time. But that's so the film in that sense is more. Um, it's kind of lefty in a new left sort of way, uh, and it's limited in that sense to some extent. Um, I think modern critics would have criticized that. They would have said, where are the black people in the even in crowd scenes, even with the teenage girls? I think there's one black girl, and that's it. So it was an unintegrated white Britain that was being shown. Maybe that's why it was so popular in Rhodesia. That was a kind of an interesting kind of thing. But I wouldn't say the film is racist. It's just unconscious about something.
Well, that was my question, Art. And, I did think I'm a Beatles fan. I was, but not the early Beatles because to me, it was bubblegum. I love the way that they developed into more sophisticated and deeper subject matter. I loved that.
Yeah.
But I didn't like the film at all. And it was because, yeah, yeah.
Whoa.
And let me tell you this. We
Yeah.
are from Cal. We met
Yeah.
at Cal. We married in '61. We were in Berkeley in the '60s. I've run a film group for, I don't know, 20 years. I've shown over 200 films. And you know what? As a film, this is terrible. But in order to express what you're trying to express, it's perfect. You're showing how it pulled the country into a state of fantasy about things, about understanding. I think you've got a perfect film here, but to talk about, we were so embarrassed watching that film. I'd give it a 2. I'm sorry.
Whoa.
I was raised on 1957 Wild Strawberries. You compare, now we're talking about a film, okay? So don't call this a good film. It's really interesting and it proves your point. End of story.
But I will add to that, Art. I'm not being critical
go ahead.
of your selection of
No,
the
I'm not
film.
either. Perfect.
It's a wonderful film from a historical standpoint, and it fits into your concept of the whole course. It's a great beginning.
Yeah, I
Thanks.
support that too.
I got to tell you guys, I'm shocked.
But this is what they did to people in the '60s at Cal. They made us rebels, rebel rousers, you
Yeah.
know? And you say, well, your age, I mean, this guy's 91. So
Really?
he can
Wow.
outdo you on age.
Well, just think, Wilford Brambell is 40 years younger than you in that film.
Oh, that's shocking. That's shocking. Okay.
There is a story, if I might jump in, that at a party that Lennon was at a little after this time period, a woman came up to him and they were talking, and she said to him, "Do you think you could write a song with words with more than one syllable?"
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, he could.
And he turned out he could, of course. Yeah.
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 Why do you think the Beatles
Imagine.
in that sophisticated way, that you guys,
What was the question again?
they changed completely.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
But this I love you, you love me, hey, hey,
Oh.
hey, kind of stuff just doesn't do it for me.
But it wasn't even the songs, the acting, which has been touted. I looked at IMDb and I looked at Metacritic, and the top critics uniformly give it 100 out of 100.
Yeah.
I could not believe it. The lowest score was a 70.
Oh, God.
But I don't know if they were writing at the time or
Well,
in
it's not the-
retrospect.
It's not the seventh seal.
It is definitely not the seventh seal. So
And I would say the seventh seal affected me in a more deeper way than this.
sure.
But this film was still a liberating film for many
Yeah,
people.
I
Don't-
believe that.
Don't think of how it appeared in Cal in Berkeley. You guys still live in Berkeley?
No,
Oh,
Santa Cruz.
oh, well, that's just as good. Almost.
Yeah.
he's a retired professor and I'm a retired art critic, so watch out for us.
Oh, okay. I mean, one has to ask rather, how was this film revolutionary when it was viewed in Des Moines?
That's right. We really approve and appreciate your choice of the film for that reason.
Yeah.
Our problem is with calling it, by some other people's standards, a good film.
Well,
I like to.
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. What I want to disagree 100% with Lou and Joan. I actually love the movie. Love the songs. You know, I like to sing, so I just feel like at the time it was a perfect pill to take. And it was the beginning of something new, as you explained it. So in a sense that it really is a good pick for your first movie, Art, and the way you have explained it and framed it, I think you've done a fantastic job.
Dylan, we totally approve of
Yes.
what you're saying, every minute of it.
Okay.
I think films like Strawberries and Seventh Seal are really sort of beatnik films,
Mhm.
Presso films. And this film is not that way, as Jim was saying. And I think there's a difference. I'll talk about it next week. But the counterculture, when it was the counterculture, is hugely optimistic. And this film is optimistic in that way too. And you can say it's shallow optimism. But I actually thought, no, I sort of agree, I have to say, with Doug. I enjoyed this. I enjoyed it when it came out. I enjoyed it the last time I saw it. And the songs, I don't know, they're high energy. They're really high energy. But I think we now know what critics would have said about this film if it had just come out. Okay, and there's a lot of negative things one could say, but Kate, how was this film viewed in Rhodesia? Is she there?
Someone raised a hand there. Art, Richard.
Would you?
Richard's raised his hand. Yeah, what do I do? Unmute him? I'll ask.
Yeah.
Unmute. Yeah.
Well, I can't. I've asked him to unmute. I can't actually unmute him. There he is. Yeah.
I see.
I think I did. This is kind of an uncomfortable.
Ask to unmute. Oh,
This is kind of an uncomfortable discussion for me because at the time that we're talking about, I was newly in the Air Force, and my focus of attention was decidedly not on what was going on societally. So for me, this is a looking back into something that I didn't experience at the time. So, you know, I wasn't in Des Moines and I wasn't in Berkeley. I was kind of disconnected. And from Las Vegas, I went to Germany for 3 years. And that was sort of a disconnected, non-societal reaction place. So it's interesting for me to hear these discussions from people who experienced it and reacted to it in the time. But I sure didn't have that experience myself.
I was talking over the weekend to a classmate of mine from high school who went in a completely different direction and ended up flying helicopters in Vietnam. And I was shocked to think that somebody from my high school would have ended up doing that. And he and on the other side of it is through my wife, we actually have connections with the government of Vietnam, and I've had very interesting discussions with the head of the Vietnamese American uh, bureaucracy, and and the the difference of experience is really huge. I mean, we have that connection because my wife Judy visited Vietnam in 1970 while the bombing was going on. She's Canadian, so she could do that. She has a green card, and we're a little bit wary now about things that might happen. But so my experience, and my experience of Vietnam was being in anti-war demonstrations. His experience was flying helicopters, and he's not happy with it now, but at the time, he certainly thought it was the right thing to be doing. So there's this cultural gulf that exists in terms of the experience that people have. And especially, I had to tell him the Vietnamese up until 2 years ago were hugely pro-American.
Yeah.
And Hanoi now has skyscrapers and the largest Samsung manufacturing outside of Korea. That but that people's experience, the movies we are seeing are our experience of the 60s. And only with Coming Home is there an experience of the other side to some extent, as we'll see. But I have to say about that also. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I'm Dick's wife, and he's had his experience. We're talking about different perspectives here about that era. I had 3 children,
Ah,
so this was totally peripheral to my existence. I remember very well when he was on when they were on Ed Sullivan's show. I had a friend who was kind of connected to that, but it was irrelevant in
huh,
my world. So that's a completely different kind of perspective on the early 60s,
yeah.
because I had huge responsibilities that didn't include time for being a teeny bopper or whatever they were called. And Dick was off in Vietnam doing his Air Force thing.
Huh.
So there were different things going on. We weren't all enamored of the Beatles, particularly.
Did that change?
Oh yeah, I love the Beatles music now. But that changed with by learning to play a ukulele 25 years ago.
Huh.
And we have a friend who's a Beatles music expert. We've been an expert ukulele or stringed instrument bass player. And we'd go to Beatles parties where we'd do nothing but play Beatles. So I had a totally different experience within the last 15 years, as did Dick did too, of the Beatles music, and came to appreciate it. But a lot of it's very tough from a musical standpoint.
Yeah. By tough,
Complex and hard to play.
complex. Yeah.
Yeah. But at any rate, in the 60s, not everybody was involved with the Beatles.
Right.
It was just happening out there somewhere. I sure didn't have time to worry about it.
Susan, what did you think of the movie now?
I got a kick out of it. I was just telling Dick in the break, but in the break we're sitting in 2 different rooms here. And I'd
Uh-huh.
like to watch it again now that I've heard your perspective on it, and and particularly the perspective of the Roses, whom we know very well.
Yeah,
So I'd like to try it again.
yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, again, my experience is the classic cliche 60s experience. So these movies look different to me,
I'm sure they do.
and I chose them because I love them.
Yeah.
So
I think it's Lou and I are, Lou, I'm about to turn 92. I think we're just almost exactly the same age. So obviously we're looking at it from a different perspective from people who were young.
nearly 80,
You
nearly
what?
79, young people 79.
Yeah, well, that is young.
It's one of the things in talking to my wife, who was born in 1943, and I was born in
10
1940.
years younger than I, yeah.
There's a difference in the music that she listened to.
I've heard it talked about in 5-year generations. We
Yeah,
normally think of 20-year generations. I think 5 is more like it.
yeah.
Certainly culturally.
My PhD mentor, who's turned 90, says, yes, I have great grandchildren now, so that's 4. But the reality is, it's like 7 generations culturally.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, it's just things change much quicker now, for
Yeah.
sure. I mean, what did you think of Jane Fonda, Susan, if you thought about her at all, given the,
Oh, I wanted to look like her.
say that again?
I wanted to look like her.
Oh, you wanted to look like her.
Of
Yeah,
course.
yeah. Uh, yeah, I mean, it's interesting in terms of propaganda. So again, uh, my
Yeah,
wife, my wife knew Tom Hayden very well, and
yeah,
Tom Hayden got to know Jane Fonda,
right.
and we have a picture of Jane Fonda with my wife's daughter, who's a toddler, and Jane Fonda is dressed in an Easter bunny suit,
Yeah.
complete Easter bunny suit, and I'm going, is this really a traitor? I mean,
Right. But it's hard to go back now. And when I was in suburbia with little children and neighbors and babysitting groups and where's the money going to come from and on and on.
oh
It
yeah,
just didn't relate much to us, I don't think. I'd have to think about the Jane Fonda thing at the time. I think I was pretty appalled, probably.
yeah. It's and your husband was in the Air Force?
This is Dick, over here, the
Oh,
one, yeah.
huh.
But we were not married then.
Yeah.
Different.
Yeah, I was in the Air Force for 20 years, and part of my duty during the Vietnam War was became the medical expert on prisoners from Vietnam. So I had quite a bit of contact with the POWs after they got back and got a very large dose of their perception of Jane Fonda.
Yeah, yeah, I bet.
uh, so
Eh,
it's strongly influenced what I think about her. I'm sure she was motivated by very positive attitudes, but she
mhm,
may have been getting into situations that she didn't understand from
Yeah.
military point
mhm.
of view.
We're going to have a film that Jane Fonda made in the 5th week of the course that is coming home, and we can.
Mhm. Talk about that. Hey, Art, I know Mark raised his hand, but I have something to share.
Okay.
Uh, I, I'm from Venezuela originally, and in the 60s, what was popular at the time was Beatles music, but sung in Spanish by a local band who was very famous. They never acknowledged that it was songs from the Beatles. At that time, IP was not as strict, I guess. So they were very famous by playing Beatles songs without acknowledging the source. So it's
Huh.
kind of an interesting, again, the cultural aspect of it, how popular they were.
I was in El Salvador in 69 and 71, and one of the things that was going on was a complete obsession with movies. Movies changed at the local cinema every 2 days, something I was totally
wow.
unfamiliar with,
Yeah.
since it was usually a week or 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was fabulous. And they had
Yeah. I mean, it was only until I was maybe 20 that I realized, wait a minute, this song sounds like the Beatles when I moved to England. It's like, oh my God, so it's the Beatles. Anyway, Mark, you had your hand raised there.
Yeah, I have a really different response to a lot of what everybody said, all kinds of different ways. In the 60s, I was in New York. At the time that the Beatles had their big thing, I was deeply involved in all kinds of anti-war and civil rights stuff. The people I was working with were people, I mean, it's just, and the Beatles seemed like, oh God, this is some kind of fluff that's trying to distract us from the real work, which was to end the war and to get civil rights legislation passed and fix things. And it was, and at one point, it was maybe a year or two after this film, a friend of mine who was very engaged in all of the stuff that I was had said to us, he said, have you heard the Beatles stuff? It is really amazing. It's the most revolutionary music. It's so excellent. And it blew me. I mean, I sat back and I said, oh my God, where have I been? And I went back and started listening to some of that stuff, and it really was amazing. So, one last thing. When I saw the movie, which I think is for the first time. I can't remember having seen this movie before. The what struck me was those girls, those teenage girls screaming, and I thought, was there no one? And you said you made reference to it early on that that it seemed to me that it was a caricature of girls, of women, in a way that didn't show them as serious. I mean, the women that I was working with were young women. They were really marching in the streets and carrying banners and engaged with it and being furious about the guys in the movement who were dominating and all of that. And there was all that kind of conversation. It it really struck me what you said about how this was liberatory and that it came out of the 50s. And I remember the 50s, the how different that was. And I just never thought of it that way. So I'm grateful for this conversation.
I would just say that Mark. You go ahead.
What?
Oh,
Oh,
Cindy.
is it me? Is
Yeah,
it me?
Cindy.
Um, you know, I was in grad school in Minneapolis, and we were all, I mean, during the day, you were at a demonstration. At night, you went to a foreign film, preferably, Swedish. And then we would go to a party and we would dance to the Beatles music all night long. I mean, the Beatles were our relief. They really, and the film captured this, because all those things, yes, the great films, we didn't watch any film that was made in English. I mean, forget that. It had to be a foreign film. And we were demonstrating against the war, all day long. And then came the Beatles, and it was a relief. And yes, we did see the movie too, but it was just that combo of those different things, and the Beatles were a significant part of that. Even even the bubblegum ones, yes, because we could sing, we could understand them.
Kate, I want to respond to everybody. Kate.
I
I was a teenager during the Beatles, and I saw them at Shea Stadium in New York. And Mark, I can tell you there were 50,000 pubescent girls who were screaming.
Did you think it was liberating?
I was sort of aghast at, at the girls. The girl next to me, who I didn't know, grabbed my arm and dug her nails into my arm. They were just hysterical. And girls were being carried off in structures on stretchers who had fainted.
Oh, yeah.
It was
So
it was
what
quite an
was that?
experience.
I do think the feminists are right about this. And I'll give you an example. Imran Khan was the greatest cricket star that Pakistan ever produced. And when he would go on tours, there would be, in a purdah situation where they couldn't be seen, women screaming for him and saying sexual things totally unallowed in a normal situation where they're supposed to be silent. And that was a liberating thing for them to do. On the other hand, you know, it's teenage girls, so but I think it actually, no, I'm going to say that feminists are right about this, about what Mark said. Mark just laid out the division between the very serious new left and the counterculture. That the new left, yeah, I'll just say again, my wife was at a panel. She was an editor of the Berkeley Barb, and she was there as a counterculture person, and there were 3 new left people, and they were serious, 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 and she's the only person who was sunny. So I think this is something we're going to see again, especially with the movie Berkeley in the 60s. It's great, Cindy, that you were able to combine them, which is eventually that happens in Berkeley too. But yeah, it happens with People's Park. But yeah, there is this division among those people who experienced the 60s the way we're talking about. But I think what strikes very striking is that people had different experiences. And even now, listening to people, they had very different experiences at the time. You have to respect all of those. And I now have to respect my dog.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Art. What a great start. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thank you so much, Art. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. That was fascinating discussion.
Take care. We'll see you
Yeah.
next week.
See you
Bye-bye.
next week.
See ya. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.